She counted 17 steps on the way down. At step 12, she heard her own leg break. At step 17, she hit the floor and heard boots that didn't belong to her husband. A woman in a dying Arizona mining town opens the wrong drawer and finds a ledger full of numbers, too large for a small town store. Her husband doesn't ask her to forget what she saw. He throws her down the stairs. Now she's lying on the floor with a broken leg, a split lip, and a secret powerful enough to send the richest man in town to prison. A cowboy she's never met walks through the open door, picks her up, and carries her into the light. But this isn't a rescue story. Hidden inside her flour jar are $23 in stolen pennies. 3 years of planning her own escape, coin by coin. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She was saving herself. She just wasn't fast enough. Now a killer in a black vest is closing in. A dead woman's unsent letter holds a terrifying clue. And the only way out is through a fire that's about to swallow everything she has left. This is Cowboy Dusk channel, where the desert sun sets slow and the stories hit deep. We bring you tales of frontier love, unbreakable courage, and the wild hearts that dared to start over when the West was all they had left. This story reminds us that you don't have to wait for someone to save you. Sometimes the bravest escape begins with a single stolen penny and the refusal to stop counting. And that the stairs life throws you down can become the same stairs you choose to climb back up. If you felt something just listening to that intro, imagine what the full story will do to you. Smash that like button. Leave a comment telling me, what would you have hidden in your flour jar? Share this with someone who needs to hear that survival is its own kind of strength. And subscribe with the bell so you're here every time a new story rises from the dust.
Elena counted 17 steps on the way down. At step 12, she heard something break. At step 17, she heard boots that did not belong to her husband. The smell of hot dust hung in the air like something solid, thick enough to chew. Castle Dome, Arizona territory, sat baking under a June sun that turned the sky white and made the false-fronted buildings along Main Street shimmer like a fever dream. The silver mines were thinning. People were leaving. And the ones who stayed had the hollow, desperate look of gamblers who had already lost but could not bring themselves to walk away from the table. Elena Zimmerman had not meant to find the ledger. She had been looking for money to buy flour, just flour. 2 cups of it, enough to make bread for the week, because Victor had drunk away the grocery money again, and there was nothing in the pantry but dust and a tin of lard gone rancid in the heat. She knew Victor kept coins in his desk sometimes, loose change he forgot about when he was deep in a bottle. So she had gone to the desk in the upstairs bedroom, tried the drawers, found most of them locked, but one had been left open just a crack, and inside it she found not coins but a leather-bound book filled with columns of numbers. She did not understand the numbers. They were written in Victor's cramped hand, rows of figures next to dates and abbreviations she could not decipher. But something about them felt wrong. The amounts were too large for a dry goods store in a dying mining town. Some entries had been crossed out and rewritten. Others had notes in the margins in handwriting that was not Victor's, a sharper, more deliberate script. She was still holding the book when Victor appeared in the doorway. His face went white first, then red. Not the blotchy, whiskey-fueled red she had learned to read like a weather vane. This was something different. This was fear turning to fury, and it happened so fast she did not have time to put the book down or step back or say, "I was just looking for flour money, Victor. I did not mean anything by it." He crossed the room in 2 strides, ripped the ledger from her hands, and then his palm hit her chest and she was falling backward through the bedroom door, hitting the top step with her shoulder. And the world became a tumbling, breaking, screaming thing that seemed to last forever and no time at all. She counted the steps. She did not know why. Maybe because counting was the only thing her mind could do while her body was beyond her control. At step 12, she heard a crack in her left leg, sharp and final, like a green branch snapping. At step 17, she hit the floor at the bottom, and the counting stopped and there was only pain. Above her, Victor's footsteps retreated. The bedroom door slammed. She could hear him pacing, muttering, opening and closing drawers. Not the sounds of a man who had forgotten what he had done. The sounds of a man who was afraid of what would happen next. Elena lay on the dusty floor of the house and stared at the ceiling. The calico dress was torn at the shoulder. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and spread across the floorboards. Her left leg was angled wrong below the knee, and every breath sent fire through her ribs. She tasted blood where she had bitten through her lip on the way down. Through the open front door, she could see the main street of Castle Dome. The afternoon sun made everything look bleached and unreal. A mule stood tied to a post across the way, head drooping. Two men walked past on the boardwalk without looking in. Nobody stopped. Nobody ever stopped. She tried to drag herself toward the door. Her arms worked, but her left leg was useless, and the pain that shot through it when she moved made her vision go white. She stopped, lay still, breathed in small, careful sips, because anything deeper made her ribs scream. 3 years. She had been in this house for 3 years. She had come to Castle Dome as a mail-order bride at 20 years old, full of the kind of hope that now made her want to laugh until she cried. Victor Zimmerman had written such good letters. Kind letters. Letters full of plans and gentle humor and descriptions of the Arizona sky at sunset. She had believed every word. She had packed her trunk in Missouri, kissed her parents' graves, hugged her brother Thomas, and boarded a westbound train toward a future that turned out to be a locked door and a man who hit. The front door stood open. She could see the street. She could not reach it. Then she heard boots on the boardwalk, not Victor's heavy, stomping tread. These were different, measured, steady. The boots stopped just outside the door. Harrison Grant was 27 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. He had just finished delivering a silver shipment from the Florida Plata mine to the company office at the far end of town, and he was walking back to the boarding house thinking about nothing more complicated than water, shade, and the letter he needed to write to the land agent in Silver City about that 20-acre parcel he had been watching. He heard shouting as he passed the Zimmerman place. A man's voice, sharp and panicked, not just angry. Then silence, the kind of silence that comes after something has been decided. Harrison almost kept walking. He had learned in the hardest way a man could learn that stepping into other people's homes got people killed. He had learned it in Brazos County, Texas, in a small house on a creek where his sister Hannah had lived with her husband Jacob. He had learned it with a pistol in his hand and blood on the floor, and Hannah's voice saying words he would hear for the rest of his life. "You should have come sooner." He looked down at his hands, remembered Hannah's hands, cold and still 3 days after he finally acted. He stopped walking, turned toward the open door, stepped inside. The woman was crumpled at the bottom of the stairs like something discarded. Dark hair loose, dress torn, left leg angled in a way that made his stomach turn. She was conscious. Her eyes found him, and he saw something he recognized. Not just pain, not just fear, the particular flatness of a person who has stopped expecting help. He knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her, keeping his hands where she could see them. He read the rest of it in the seconds it took for his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. Finger-shaped bruises, already darkening on her arms. A split lip half-healed from days before. The way she flinched when his hand moved toward her. An involuntary recoil that had been trained into her body by repetition. "I fell," she said. Her voice was steady and practiced. She had said this sentence before, many times, and had learned to make it sound almost true. Harrison did not challenge the lie. There was no point. She knew the truth. He knew the truth. Arguing about it would only cost time she did not have. "Your leg is broken," he said. "I am taking you to the doctor." Footsteps above them. The bedroom door opened, and Victor Zimmerman appeared at the top of the stairs. He was a thick man, soft in the middle, but his face was not flushed with drink. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He looked at Harrison, and something shifted behind his expression that was not quite anger, and not quite fear, but some cold mixture of both. "You do not know what you are walking into, cowboy," Victor said. "Walk away." It was not a threat. Harrison heard it clearly. It was a warning. The kind of warning a man gave when the danger was not coming from him, but from somewhere behind him, somewhere bigger. Harrison filed it away. Rose slowly. Positioned himself between Elena and the stairs. "I am taking her to the doctor," he said again. "You can come along or you can stay here. Makes no difference to me. But she is not staying on this floor." Victor stared at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the top of the stairs and said nothing more. Harrison turned to Elena. "I am going to lift you now," he said. "It is going to hurt, and I am sorry for that. Can you put your arms around my neck?" She looked at him, looked at the stairs where Victor had been standing, looked back at Harrison. Then she raised her arms. He gathered her as carefully as he could, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. She made a sound when her broken leg shifted, a short, bitten-off cry that she killed before it could fully form. He felt her hands grip the back of his shirt and hold on. He carried her out through the front door and into the blazing afternoon. The sun hit them both like a slap. Behind them, Victor did not follow. He stood at the upstairs window and watched them go. Then he sat down at his desk, took out a sheet of paper, wrote a short note, folded it, and called for his store clerk. "Take this to Mr. Crane," he said. His hand was shaking. "Take it now." The clerk left through the back door at a run. Harrison did not see any of this. He was already halfway down the street carrying Elena Zimmerman toward the doctor's office. And he did not know that the ledger she had glimpsed contained enough evidence to put half of Castle Dome behind the walls of the territorial prison at Yuma. And the man who owned those numbers had just been told there was a problem. Dr. James Whitfield had set 43 broken bones in 10 years at Castle Dome. 27 of them belonged to women. He did not write the word accident in a single file. The sound of sand against glass. That was what Elena heard as Harrison carried her up the stairs to the doctor's office above the assay building. The wind had picked up, driving fine desert grit against the window panes, and the hissing sound of it was the only thing she could focus on besides the pain. She focused on it hard. She counted the grains she could not see, because counting was what she did when the world narrowed down to what she could endure. Whitfield's office was spare and clean. A narrow examination table, glass-fronted cabinets of instruments and bottles, a desk covered with papers. The doctor himself was a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, gray at the temples, steady-handed. He emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth, and took one look at Elena, and said nothing for a moment that spoke louder than words. "Bring her through," he said quietly. "Put her on the table." Harrison laid her down with the same care he had shown on the street. He stepped back, hat in his hands, and Elena felt the loss of his presence like a door closing against a cold wind. She did not understand that feeling. She did not have time to examine it. Whitfield's hands were efficient and gentle. He cut away the stocking on her left leg and examined the break with fingers that probed carefully, watching her face for the levels of pain that would tell him what he needed to know. "Broken below the knee," he said. "Clean break, not shattered. 2 ribs cracked on the left side. Extensive bruising across the torso and arms." His voice was professionally flat. But his eyes, when they met Elena's, held something that was not medical detachment. It was recognition. He had seen this before. He had seen it too many times. "I need to set the leg," he said. "It will hurt considerably. I can give you laudanum for the pain." "No," Elena said, not because she feared the drug, because she needed her mind clear. There were numbers in her head, columns of figures she had seen in Victor's ledger, and the pain in her leg was nothing compared to the fear that she would forget them if she let her thoughts go soft and blurred. Something in that book had been worth breaking her bones over. She intended to remember what she had seen. Harrison had moved to the window. He stood with his back to the room, looking out at the street below, giving Elena what privacy he could. But he was listening. He heard the way she refused the laudanum, not with the trembling voice of a woman in shock, but with the flat certainty of someone making a tactical decision. He filed that away too. While Whitfield prepared to set the leg, Harrison stepped into the hallway and waited. When the doctor came out briefly to fetch additional bandaging, Harrison stopped him. "How many women in this town fall downstairs?" he asked. His voice was low. It was not really a question. Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. He was a cautious man. He had survived 10 years in Castle Dome by keeping his head down and his mouth shut and treating whatever came through his door without asking the kind of questions that got people hurt. "Enough that I keep a separate book," he said finally. Then he went back into the examination room and closed the door. The setting of the leg was bad. Elena knew it would be bad, and it was worse than she had prepared for. The pain was blinding, absolute, a white-hot thing that obliterated thought and left only the animal need to scream. She bit through her lip again, the same split that was still healing from 2 days ago. And she tasted fresh blood and felt tears streaming down her temples into her hair, and she did not scream. She did not scream because screaming was something Victor had taught her not to do. And even though Victor was not here, the lesson held. It was over in seconds that felt like hours. Whitfield splinted the leg, wrapped it tight, bound her ribs with firm, practiced hands. When he was done, Elena lay gasping and shaking on the table, but her mind was clear. The numbers were still there. She held onto them like coins in a jar. "You need rest," Whitfield said. "At least a week before you can begin to put any weight on that leg, and then only carefully with a crutch. The ribs will heal on their own if you do not strain them." Elena nodded. Then she said something that surprised both Whitfield and Harrison, who had come back into the room. "I need my flour jar," she said. "From the kitchen of my house. Can someone bring it to me?" Harrison looked at her. She looked back at him, steady and direct, despite the pain, and he saw something in her eyes that he had not expected. Not gratitude, not helplessness, calculation. This woman was thinking, planning. Even with a broken leg and cracked ribs and blood on her lip, she was 3 steps ahead of where he expected her to be. "I will get it," he said. Harrison took Elena to the boarding house. He carried her through the front door, and Mrs. Patterson appeared from the kitchen, a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Elena in Harrison's arms and did not gasp or flutter or ask what had happened. She asked how many pillows Elena needed and whether she preferred her water cold or at room temperature. "Ground floor room," Patterson said. "Used to be storage. Got a bed and a window. It is not fancy, but it is private, and it is cool." Harrison laid Elena on the narrow bed, and Patterson arranged pillows to prop her leg. Blankets were produced, water, a basin for washing. Patterson moved with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had handled crises before and did not intend to waste time on the emotions surrounding them. When Elena was settled, Harrison stepped toward the door. Patterson followed him out and caught his arm in the hallway. "You know whose nest you are poking," she said. Her voice was quiet, but her grip was firm. "Victor Zimmerman does not scare me. The man behind Victor does." Harrison looked at her. "What man behind Victor?" Patterson studied his face, deciding how much to say. "Silas Crane," she said. "Owns the Flora de Plata mine. Owns half the town if you count the people who owe him. My husband worked a claim next to Crane's land. Had a mining accident 3 years ago." She paused. "I do not believe it was an accident." She released his arm and went back into Elena's room without another word. Harrison walked back to the Zimmerman house in the late afternoon heat. The sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline, but the air was still brutal, thick and dry, the kind of heat that made a man's thoughts slow and sticky. He thought about Crane. He thought about the way Victor had said, "You do not know what you are walking into." He thought about Patterson's hand on his arm and the word she had used, nest. He did not want this. He had come to Castle Dome to work, to save money, to buy land somewhere green and quiet where he could raise horses and sleep through the night without dreaming of Hannah's face. He was not here to fight. He was here to earn and leave. The Zimmerman house was quiet when he arrived. The front door stood open as it had when he first walked in. But Victor was gone. The upstairs bedroom door was ajar. Harrison climbed the stairs, 17 of them, counting without meaning to, and looked inside. The desk drawer that had been locked was open. Empty. Papers that had been stacked on the desk were gone. Victor had cleared the room of anything incriminating. Almost anything. On the floor beside the desk, half under a boot print, lay a single torn sheet of paper, a column of numbers in Victor's handwriting, the top of the page ripped away where it had been separated from something larger. Harrison picked it up, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. He went downstairs to the kitchen. It was a small, hot room, clean enough but bare. A cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with sparse provisions, and on the counter beside the stove a large flour jar with a ceramic lid. He picked it up. It was heavier than a jar of flour should be. He did not open it. It was not his to open. He put it in the carpet bag he filled with Elena's things, her few dresses from the wardrobe, a hairbrush and pins, a framed daguerreotype of a man and woman who must have been her parents, a small wooden box containing a gold ring and a bundle of letters tied with string. He carried it all back to the boarding house through streets gone orange with the setting sun. Castle Dome was quiet in the way of dying towns, not peaceful but exhausted, the silence of people who had stopped believing things would get better. Back in her room, Elena lay in the gathering dark and mouthed numbers to herself. She did not know what they meant. But Victor had been willing to throw her down 17 stairs to keep her from seeing them, and that meant they were worth remembering. Inside the flour jar were $23.70. 3 years of Elena's life measured in stolen pennies. But Harrison also found something else. An unsent letter. Morning came with the sound of birds in the boarding house courtyard and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Elena woke to a symphony of pain, every breath reminding her of cracked ribs, her left leg throbbing in its splint with a steady, insistent ache that she knew would be her companion for weeks. But she was alive. She was not in Victor's house. And that, for the first time in 3 years, felt like enough. Mrs. Patterson brought breakfast on a tray. Eggs, bread, coffee with real cream. Elena ate with a hunger that surprised her. She had not had a meal she could enjoy without fear in longer than she cared to remember. In Victor's house, every meal was a performance. She cooked what he wanted, served it when he wanted it, and sat in silence while he ate, gauging his mood by the way he held his fork, ready to apologize for any imperfection before his temper found it first. "That cowboy has been up since before dawn," Patterson said conversationally, settling into the room's single chair. "Went to your house at first light, came back with a bag of your things and that flour jar you asked about. He is in the kitchen now, waiting for you to say whether he can come in." Elena's hands went still on her coffee cup. "He went to my house. Was Victor there?" "He was." Patterson's eyes held a dry gleam. "Harrison told me your husband tried to refuse him entry. Harrison informed him that he could hand over your belongings in a peaceable fashion, or Harrison would take them regardless, and the sheriff could sort out the particulars afterward. Your husband chose peaceable." "Send him in," Elena said. Patterson helped Elena arrange herself more properly against the pillows, smoothing the borrowed nightgown and the blanket. Then Harrison came in, and the small room seemed to shrink around his broad shoulders. He carried the carpet bag in one hand and the flour jar in the other. He set both on the bed beside Elena and stepped back, hat in his hands. Elena opened the carpet bag first. She touched each item as she drew it out. The dresses she had sewn herself, the hairbrush with the mother-of-pearl handle that had been her mother's, the daguerreotype of her parents standing outside their bakery in Missouri, the wooden box with her mother's wedding ring, and the letters from home. These were the whole of her material life, everything she owned that Victor had not already destroyed or pawned. She held the daguerreotype for a long moment, looking at her father's serious face and her mother's gentle one, and she felt something crack open in her chest that was not a rib. Then she opened the flour jar. She poured the contents onto the blanket without ceremony. Coins rang and scattered across the quilt, pennies and nickels and a few dimes, some of them green with age, all of them earned in secret. She counted them with the quick, practiced fingers of a baker's daughter who had learned arithmetic at her father's elbow. $23.70. Harrison watched her count. He did not ask. Elena looked up at him and her eyes were hard and clear. No trace of the helplessness he might have expected. "I was not waiting to be saved," she said. "I was saving myself. I just was not fast enough." The words landed in the room and changed the shape of everything. Harrison looked at this woman, broken leg propped on pillows, bruises fading on her arms, counting stolen pennies with the precision of a bookkeeper. And he understood that he had been wrong about her. She was not a victim who needed rescuing. She was a prisoner who had been planning her own escape for 3 years, coin by coin, and the only thing that had stopped her was time. There was something else in the jar. Below the coins, wrapped in a scrap of cloth and tucked against the bottom, was a folded letter. Elena drew it out and looked at it, and her face went still. "I wrote this 8 months ago," she said quietly. "It is addressed to my brother Thomas in Missouri. I was asking him for help, asking him to send money for a train ticket. But Victor runs the mail through his store. He reads everything that goes in and out. I could not send it." Harrison took the letter from her and turned it over in his hands. The envelope was sealed, the address written in a clear, careful hand. He could feel the weight of those 8 months in the paper, the hope and the desperation, and the slow, crushing realization that even this small act of reaching out was impossible under Victor's control. "I can send this," Harrison said. "The mining company has a courier that runs to Tucson twice a month. He does not go through the store." Elena nodded. Then she said something quietly, almost to herself, that Harrison heard and would remember for a long time. "I do not need much, just enough to stand on my own ground." He did not know yet how literally she meant it. Harrison reached into his shirt pocket and produced the torn sheet of paper he had found on Victor's floor. He handed it to Elena. "Found this by his desk. Looks like it was torn from something larger." Elena took the page and studied it. The numbers were in Victor's handwriting, a column of figures beside dates. She compared them to what she remembered from the ledger, the fragments she had been repeating to herself since the fall. Some matched, others were new. She did not understand the pattern yet, but her baker's mind worked on it the way it worked on recipes, sensing proportions, noticing when something was off. She tucked the page into the flour jar with the coins. Evidence and escape money kept together. "Harrison," she said, "what did Victor mean when he said you did not know what you were walking into?" Harrison sat down in the chair Patterson had vacated. He told Elena what Patterson had told him about Silas Crane, about the mine and the town, and Patterson's husband, who had died in a convenient accident. Elena listened without interrupting, her face growing more still with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "The numbers in that ledger were too large for a dry goods store. I did not understand them when I saw them. But if Victor is moving money for Crane, laundering silver through the store, then those numbers make sense. They are shipment records, amounts, and dates." Harrison stared at her. "You figured that out lying at the bottom of a staircase with a broken leg. I figured it out because my father ran a business and I grew up reading his books. I know what honest numbers look like." Those numbers were not honest. They looked at each other across the small room, and something passed between them that was not quite trust, and not yet anything more. It was recognition. Two people who had been carrying heavy things alone, and had just realized there might be someone to share the weight. Harrison went out that afternoon while Elena rested. He went to the saloon and sat in a corner with a beer he barely touched and listened. Miners talked freely when they were drinking, and what Harrison heard confirmed what Patterson and Elena had suggested, and then some. The Florida Plata was thinning out. Everyone knew it. Crane had been buying smaller claims for months, using rigged assay reports and outright intimidation. A man named Halloran had refused to sell his claim in March and had been found dead at the bottom of a mine shaft a week later. Another miner named Briggs had packed up and left town overnight, leaving behind tools, provisions, and a fully stocked claim. Nobody believed he had left voluntarily. Nobody said so out loud. Victor's store was the financial hub of the scheme. Every ounce of silver crane pulled out of the ground, legal or not, passed through Victor's books before it reached the outside world. The store's ledgers made illegal silver look legitimate. And Victor, trapped by gambling debts and Crane's leverage, had no way out except to keep falsifying the numbers and pray that nobody looked too closely. Somebody had looked too closely. Elena had opened the wrong drawer. Harrison walked back to the boarding house as the sun dropped and the desert sky turned purple and orange. He did not want this. He kept telling himself he did not want this. He had come to Castle Dome to earn money and leave, to buy land, to build something quiet and permanent and far away from the kind of trouble that ended with gunshots and graves. The last time he had gotten involved in someone else's marriage, he had put a bullet through his brother-in-law's chest and watched his sister die 3 days later anyway. He had earned that lesson in blood. He should have learned it. But when he brought a bowl of broth to Elena's room that evening and found her standing on her good leg, white-faced with pain, one hand gripping the windowsill so hard her knuckles were bone-white, trying to prove to herself that she could stand, he understood something that he could not explain away or reason past. She did not need him to save her. She needed someone to stand beside her while she saved herself. That was a different thing, and it was something he could do. He set the broth on the bedside table. "Need a hand getting back to the bed?" he asked, keeping his voice easy. She turned her head and looked at him, and for just a moment the mask slipped and he saw how frightened she was. Not of Victor, not of Crane, of the unknown, of the vast, terrifying openness of a future she could not yet see the shape of. Then the mask came back and she said, "I can manage," and she managed, lowering herself to the bed with her jaw set and her eyes dry. And he respected her for it more than he could say. Later that evening, after Harrison had gone to his own room, Ruth Patterson came to sit with Elena. She brought tea and a plate of shortbread, and the particular brand of comfortable silence that only women of a certain age and experience could maintain. They sat without speaking for a while, listening to the desert wind against the shutters. Then Patterson said, "You are not the first, you know." Elena looked at her. "Not the first what?" "Not the first woman Victor sent for. There was one before you. Lillian, her name was. Came the same way you did. Mail order. Mail. Full of hope. Lasted about 2 years. Then one morning Victor told everyone she had left him. Gone back east, he said. Nobody questioned it. Nobody liked to ask. Elena felt the blood leave her face. She set down her teacup carefully because her hands had begun to shake. "Did anyone actually see her leave?" she asked. Patterson was quiet for a long time. The wind pushed sand against the window. The lamp flickered. "No," she said finally. "I do not suppose anyone did." Elena lay awake for hours after Patterson left. The question of Lillian hung in the dark above her like a blade. Had the woman escaped? Had she made it out? Or had something else happened, something the town had chosen not to see? The way they chose not to see the bruises on Elena's arms and the split lips and the way she flinched at loud sounds. She was not just fleeing a violent husband anymore. She might be fleeing a man who had already made one wife disappear. In the morning, the world shifted again. A man Elena had never seen walked into the saloon and asked the bartender a question, in a voice soft enough that only the men nearest heard it. "I hear there is a runaway wife in this town," the man said. "Where is she?" He wore a black vest over a clean white shirt. He carried a pistol under his coat in a shoulder holster, not on his hip, where everyone could see it. His face was lean and unremarkable, and his eyes were the flat, patient eyes of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted without raising his voice. His name was Dutton. Nobody knew his full name. Nobody wanted to. His name was Dutton. Nobody knew his full name. Nobody wanted to. The air smelled like creosote and coming thunder, that sharp, resinous scent the desert gave off before a storm that might or might not arrive. Eleanor could smell it through the open window of her room at the boarding house, and something about it set her nerves on edge, the way animals grow restless before weather they cannot see but can feel in their bones. Dutton went to Victor first. He found him at the store, not behind the counter but in the back room, sitting at a table with a bottle of whiskey he had not yet opened, and a look on his face like a man awaiting sentencing. Victor had been expecting someone. He had sent the note to Crane 2 days ago, and he knew what Crane's response would be. Crane did not handle problems personally. Crane sent Dutton. The conversation was brief and it was quiet. Dutton sat across from Victor and did not touch the whiskey and did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he knows he does not need to shout to be heard. "Get your wife home." That was what Dutton said. "Or I will make sure she does not talk to anyone. How I do that is up to you." Victor's hands were flat on the table. They were trembling, not from drink. He had not touched the bottle. They were trembling because he understood exactly what Dutton meant, and he understood that the threat was not coming from Dutton personally, but from Crane, and Crane's patience was not infinite, and Victor had already used up most of it. "She does not know anything," Victor said. "She saw numbers. She does not understand what they mean." Dutton looked at him with eyes like two flat stones. "That is not what Mr. Crane wants to hear. Mr. Crane wants to hear that your wife is back in your house where she belongs, and that the situation is contained. Can you tell him that?" Victor could not tell him that. His wife was at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with a broken leg and a cowboy standing guard. And the look in her eyes when Harrison carried her out had been the look of a woman who was never coming back. Victor had broken many things in their marriage, but he had never broken her will, and he knew it, and it frightened him almost as much as Dutton did. "I will talk to her," Victor said. "You will do more than talk," Dutton said. He stood, straightened his vest, looked at Victor with an expression that might have been pity if it had contained any warmth at all. 2 days. After that, Mr. Crane will solve the problem himself." Dutton left through the back door. Victor sat alone in the storeroom with the unopened bottle and the shaking hands, and the knowledge that he had started something he could not stop. He had sent for a mail-order bride 3 years ago because he was lonely and thought a wife would fix him. He had sent for another one before that, Lillian, for the same reason. He had broken them both because the thing that was broken was inside him, not inside them, and no amount of gentle letters or hopeful promises could change what he became when the door was closed and the whiskey was open and the fear was pressing in. He thought about Lillian. He thought about the money Crane had given him to make her disappear, not to kill her. Crane was not wasteful. Dead wives attracted marshals. Crane had given Victor $200 to put Lillian on a stage to San Francisco with enough cash to start over, and a clear understanding that she was never to come back or write or tell anyone where she had been. Victor had done it. He had watched Lillian climb onto that stage with a carpet bag and a bruised face, and he had felt nothing but relief. One problem solved. But Elena was different. Elena had seen the ledger. Lillian had been an inconvenience. Elena was a threat. Victor opened the bottle. At the boarding house, Elena was doing something she had not done in 3 years. She was thinking about the future. Not the future as she had imagined it before coming west, full of children and a warm kitchen and a husband who loved her. That future was dead. She had buried it slowly over 36 months of fists and silence. But a different future, harder and sharper and more real, was beginning to take shape in her mind. A future that started with understanding those numbers and ended with standing on her own ground. She had the torn page from Victor's ledger, and she had her memory of the full book, and she had her father's gift for figures. She sat in bed with a pencil stub and a piece of brown paper Patterson had given her, and she wrote down every number she could remember. The columns began to make a rough sense, dates that corresponded with silver shipments from the mine, amounts that were far larger than what a legitimate dry goods business should be processing. Some entries marked with a symbol she could not decipher, a small cross beside certain figures, which she guessed indicated something separate from the regular transactions. Smuggled silver, maybe. Off-the-books production that Crane was running through Victor's store to clean it. She did not have enough to be certain. But she had enough to be afraid, because if she was right, then the stakes of her escape had just risen from personal survival to something much larger and much more dangerous. The knock came at mid-morning. Not Harrison's knock, which was firm but patient. A single rap followed by a pause. This was rapid and urgent, 3 sharp beats, and before Patterson could answer, Victor's voice came through the door. "Elena? I need to talk to you, please." Patterson looked at Elena. Elena's face had gone white, but her voice was steady when she said, "Let him in, but stay close." Patterson opened the door, and Victor stepped inside, and the room changed. He brought with him the smell of whiskey he had not yet drunk, and sweat, and something else, something acrid and desperate that Elena recognized as fear. She had never seen Victor afraid before. She had seen him angry, cruel, mean drunk, and cold sober, had seen him calculating and careless, and every shade of dangerous. But she had never seen him like this. His eyes darting to the window every few seconds, his hands opening and closing at his sides, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow from behind. "Elena, you have to come home," he said. His voice was not commanding. It was pleading. "You do not understand what is happening. There are men involved in this who are far more dangerous than me. I was trying to protect you." Elena stared at him from the bed. "Protect me," she repeated. "You threw me down the stairs, Victor. You broke my leg." Victor flinched. It was small and fast, but she saw it, and it did something strange to her. For 3 years, she had been the one flinching. Seeing it on his face was disorienting, like looking at a familiar room in a mirror and finding everything reversed. "I know what I did," he said. "I know. But you have to believe me. There are people who will do worse, much worse. If you stay here, if you talk to anyone about what you saw, they will not just hurt you. They will make you disappear." "Like Lillian," Elena said. The name hit Victor like a physical blow. His face drained of color so completely that for a moment he looked like a different person, a younger man, a man who had not yet become what Castle Dome and Crane and whiskey had made him. "How do you know about Lillian?" he whispered. Elena did not answer that. Instead, she watched him, and she noticed something she filed away for later. As he stood in the room, his eyes had moved to the flower jar on her bedside table, and his expression when he saw it was not anger or confusion. It was relief. He was glad the jar was here and not at the house. She did not understand why. "I am not coming back," she said. Victor stood there for a long moment, a man caught between forces he could not control. Then he left. He did not slam the door. He closed it carefully, quietly, like a man trying not to wake something sleeping, and his footsteps retreated down the hallway and out the front door, and were gone. Elena sat very still and tried to understand what she had just seen. Victor begging. Victor afraid. Victor warning her about danger that was not coming from him. None of it fit the picture she had built over 3 years of marriage, the picture of a man who was simply cruel because cruelty was his nature. This was more complicated. This was a man who was cruel because he was trapped, and the trap was not of his own making, or not entirely. It did not forgive him. Nothing forgave what he had done to her. But it complicated things in ways she did not yet know how to handle. That evening, Harrison came to her room. He had spent the day working, riding patrol for the mining company, keeping his head down and his eyes open. He had seen Dutton in town, had noted the black vest and the shoulder holster, and the flat, careful way the man moved through the streets, looking at everything and seeming to look at nothing. He had asked a few casual questions at the saloon and learned Dutton's reputation. A fixer, a man who solved problems for people who could afford not to get their own hands dirty. The name that kept coming up alongside Dutton's was Silas Crane's. Harrison sat in the chair by Elena's bed and told her what he had learned. Elena told him about Victor's visit, about the fear in his eyes and the plea in his voice and the strange look of relief when he saw the flower jar. Then Harrison told her about Hannah. Not the clean version. Not the version where he was the hero who arrived too late. The real version. The one that kept him awake at night and made him clean his pistol in the dark, even though he had sworn he would never point it at a man again. He told her he had known Jacob was beating Hannah for 6 months before the final night. Hannah had written to him. Then she had written again begging him not to come, saying Jacob would change, saying his interference would make things worse. Harrison had told himself he was respecting her wishes. He had told himself it was her marriage, her decision, her life. He had waited, and waited. And the waiting had become its own kind of violence, a passive cruelty disguised as respect. Then, one night, on instinct, on a feeling he could not explain, he had ridden to their homestead outside Waco and come through the door and found Jacob's hands around Hannah's throat and Hannah's feet 6 inches off the ground and her face the color of a bruise. He shot Jacob dead, center of the chest. The man dropped like a cut rope and Hannah fell to the floor gasping, and Harrison gathered her up and held her and told her it was over. But it was not over. The damage Jacob had done over months, the internal injuries from beatings she had hidden, and Harrison had allowed himself not to see, the ruptured organs and the slow bleeding inside her body. None of that had stopped. Hannah died 3 days later in Harrison's arms, and her last words were not, "I love you," or "I forgive you," or even "goodbye." Her last words were, "You should have come sooner." Harrison's voice was rough when he finished. He was not looking at Elena. He was looking at his hands, the same hands that had held the pistol, the same hands that had held his sister as she died. And Elena could see that he carried those hands like weapons he did not trust. "I did not fail because I acted too late," he said. "I failed because I knew and I chose to wait. I told myself I was respecting her wishes. The truth is I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I got involved. Afraid of making it worse. And while I was being afraid, she was dying." Elena did not say anything for a long moment. She reached across the space between the bed and the chair and took his hand. Just held it. She did not tell him it was not his fault, because he would not have believed her, and because the truth was more complicated than that. She did not tell him he was a good man, because he was not ready to hear it. She just held his hand, and it was the first time anyone had touched Harrison Grant, not because he was strong or useful or needed, but because he was hurting, and the simplicity of that nearly broke him. They sat that way until the lamp burned low. Then the night cracked open. A sound at the window, the scrape of metal on wood. Both of them froze. Harrison moved first, crossing the room in 2 strides, but by the time he reached the window there was nothing but the dark courtyard and the sound of boots retreating. On the windowsill, tucked under a stone to keep it from blowing away, was a folded piece of paper. Harrison unfolded it and read it, and his face changed. Something ignited behind his eyes, something hot and dangerous that Elena had not seen before. "What does it say?" she asked. He handed it to her. The writing was neat and anonymous. "Come home, or no one finds the body." Harrison turned and headed for the door. Elena called his name, and he did not stop. She heard him cross the courtyard and slam through the boarding house gate into the street. She heard distantly the sound of his fist hitting something solid, the wall of the building, and a sound that might have been a curse or might have been a prayer. She got her crutch and made it to the courtyard, every step a battle with her broken leg, and found Harrison leaning against the adobe wall with his hand bleeding and his chest heaving and his eyes wild in the moonlight. "You cannot save me by destroying yourself, Harrison," she said. He stopped, looked at his bleeding knuckles. The wildness drained out of him, and what was left was grief, old and deep and unfinished. Grief for a sister he had failed and a past he could not rewrite. "I know," he said, "I know that. But when I saw that note, all I could see was Hannah's face." "I am not Hannah," Elena said quietly. "And you are not too late. Not this time." He looked at her. She looked at him. The moonlight made the courtyard silver, and the desert wind carried the smell of dust and sage. Between them was something new and unnamed, growing in the space where two broken people had chosen to be honest with each other. Harrison went back inside and washed his hand and wrapped it and said nothing more about the note. But neither of them slept. And in the morning, the situation got worse. Two more men rode into Castle Dome at sunrise. Harrison saw them from the boarding house window. One was young and lean and wore his gun low on his hip the way gun hands did. The other was older, thicker, with a face Harrison recognized from a wanted poster he had seen during his deputy days in Texas. The man's name was Rawlings, and he had shot a judge in Tucson 2 years ago and walked free because no witness survived long enough to testify. Dutton had brought reinforcements. The cage around Elena was getting smaller. The silver shipment was supposed to weigh 800 pounds. Harrison's horse knew the difference. The wagon sat too low in the ruts. The morning air carried the taste of alkali, flat and bitter on the tongue. The desert's way of reminding you that nothing out here was given freely. Harrison hitched the team to the ore wagon at the Flora de Plata mine yard under a sky that was already turning white with heat, and he knew before the wheels started turning that something was wrong. He had hauled enough silver for the Castle Dome Mining Company to know exactly how a wagon handled with 800 pounds of ore in the bed. He knew by the depth of the wheel ruts in the sand. He knew by the way the horses leaned into their harness. He knew by the feel of the brake on grades and the sound of the load shifting on turns. 800 pounds had a particular voice. This load was singing a different song. The manifest pinned to the seat said, 800. The wagon felt like 1,200 or more. Harrison said nothing to the mine foreman. He signed the receipt, climbed onto the seat, and drove the team out of the yard and onto the road that wound down through the hills toward Castle Dome. He was 2 miles from town when they hit him. Two riders came out of a wash on the left side of the road, bandanas pulled up over their faces, guns drawn. One fired into the air. The other pointed his pistol at Harrison and yelled something about throwing down the strongbox. Harrison had been a deputy sheriff in Brazos County, Texas, for 3 years before he quit the law. He had served warrants on men who did not want to be served. He had tracked horse thieves through brush country and broken up saloon fights where everyone had a knife. He had arrested men who were trying to kill him, and he had killed one man who was trying to kill his sister. He knew what a real ambush looked like, and this was not it. The riders were sloppy, poorly positioned. They had come out of the wash at the wrong angle, putting themselves in each other's line of fire. Their horses were too close together. One of them was holding his pistol in his left hand with his right elbow tucked against his body, the posture of a man who was not comfortable shooting. This was not a robbery. This was a test. Crane wanted to see what Harrison would do. Harrison did what a security rider was paid to do. He dropped below the wagon seat, pulled his rifle from the boot, and put a round into the dirt 2 feet in front of the nearest horse. The horse reared and the rider went sideways out of the saddle. The second rider fired wild, and Harrison fired back, not to kill, but close enough that the man felt the wind of the bullet. Both attackers turned and rode hard back into the wash, and were gone in seconds. Harrison sat on the wagon seat in the settling dust, and looked at the retreating riders, and felt a cold certainty settle into his gut. They had not been trying to steal the silver. They had been trying to gauge his nerve. And now Crane would know that Harrison Grant was not the kind of man who cut and ran. He checked the wagon for damage. One bullet had splintered the sideboards. He climbed down and examined the hole, and that was when he saw it. The bullet had punched through the outer wall of the wagon bed and revealed something beneath the surface. A second layer, a false bottom packed tight with raw silver ore that did not match the gray galena from the Flora de Plata. Harrison pulled away enough of the splintered wood to see clearly. The hidden compartment ran the full length of the wagon bed, 6 inches deep, packed with ore that was lighter in color and rougher in texture than the mine's official output. This was silver from somewhere else, public land maybe, or someone else's claim, mined illegally, hidden under legitimate shipments, sent to town to be processed through Victor Zimmerman's books and laundered into clean money. He replaced the broken board as best he could, drove the wagon into Castle Dome and delivered it to the company office and said nothing. But the cold certainty in his gut had grown into something harder. He now had physical evidence to match the numbers Elena had been puzzling over. Back at the boarding house, Elena had not been idle. She had spent the morning convincing Mrs. Patterson to help her up the stairs to Dr. Whitfield's office. The climb was agonizing. Every step sent fire through her healing leg, and her cracked ribs protested every breath. But she made it, leaning on the crutch Whitfield had given her and gritting her teeth so hard her jaw ached. And when she reached the top and stood in the doctor's doorway, breathing hard and pale-faced, Whitfield looked at her and understood she had not come for a medical visit. "I want to see the book," Elena said. Whitfield closed the door behind her. He stood with his back to it and his arms crossed and looked at her with the caution of a man who had survived in Castle Dome by keeping his mouth shut. "What book?" he said. "The one you keep separate from the patient files. The one that documents every woman in this town who fell downstairs or walked into doors or tripped over nothing at all. Harrison told me about it." "You told him enough that I keep a separate book. I want to see it." Whitfield said nothing for a long time. The clock on his wall ticked. Through the window, Elena could see the main street below. The mule still tied to its post, 2 children chasing a dog through the dust. Normal life going on in a town that was rotting from the inside. "You have kept that record for years and done nothing with it," Elena said. She was not angry. She was stating a fact. "Show it to me." "I will do what you could not." The bluntness of it made Whitfield flinch, which Elena regretted but did not take back. She understood his caution. She understood the cost of speaking in a town where Silas Crane owned the silence. But understanding did not change what she needed. Whitfield went to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it with a key he wore around his neck and drew out a leather-bound journal, smaller than a regular patient file, its pages dense with his small, precise handwriting. He handed it to Elena. She opened it and began to read, and the room went very quiet. 43 broken bones. 27 belonging to women. Concussions, burns, lacerations. Dislocated shoulders, cracked cheekbones. 3 miscarriages that Whitfield had marked with a small notation indicating suspected trauma rather than natural causes. The names were there, the dates, the descriptions of injuries, and beside each entry in the margin, the name of the woman's husband. Elena turned page after page, and a pattern emerged that made her stomach turn. The worst injuries, the most frequent entries, belonged to women whose husbands worked for Crane. Miners and teamsters and foremen who drank on Crane's whiskey and lived in Crane's housing and took their anger and their fear out on the nearest body available. The violence was not random, it was systemic. Crane's operation ran on intimidation and silence, and broken, frightened women in broken, frightened households did not ask questions or cause trouble or look too closely at ledgers they were not supposed to see. Elena closed the book. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears and might have been fury. "This is evidence," she said. Whitfield nodded slowly. "Of a kind. It is a doctor's observations. Whether a court would accept it, I cannot say. It is a pattern. Combined with other things, it is a pattern that tells a story, and stories are what courts listen to." She took the book with her when she left. Whitfield let her. He watched her navigate the stairs with her crutch and her broken leg and her jaw set like iron, and he felt something shift inside him that had been stuck for a long time. He had kept that book for 10 years, documenting what he saw, telling himself that someday someone would use it. Someday had arrived, and it looked like a 23-year-old woman with a splinted leg and stolen pennies in a flour jar. That evening in the boarding house courtyard, Elena and Harrison spread their findings on a barrel top and worked by lamplight. The torn page from Victor's ledger, the numbers Elena had memorized, Whitfield's medical journal, Harrison's account of the false-bottomed wagon. Separately, each piece was a fragment. Together they formed a picture. Crane was mining silver illegally on public land. The surplus was hidden in false-bottomed wagons and transported with legitimate shipments. Victor laundered the money through his store, making the illegal silver appear as ordinary commercial revenue. Anyone who asked questions or got in the way was silenced through intimidation, accident, or disappearance. Elena's mind worked fast. She sorted the numbers into columns, cross-referencing dates from the ledger page with what she remembered of the full book. The amounts matched shipment schedules Harrison knew. The figures were far too large for a dry goods store. The math told a clear story of fraud. They sat close together over the papers, their heads nearly touching, working in the concentrated silence of two people solving a problem that mattered. Elena's hand moved quickly over the brown paper where she was copying figures. Harrison pointed to discrepancies in the shipping manifests he had seen, marking dates where the loads were heavier than claimed. Their fingers brushed over a shared page and neither mentioned it. But when Elena looked up and found Harrison watching her in the lamplight, something passed across his face that she had no name for and no defense against. She looked away first, not from fear, from the understanding that she was not ready for whatever that expression meant, and might not be for a long time. Across the street, in the dark space between two buildings, Dutton stood and watched. He had seen the cowboy and the woman hunched over papers in the lamplight. He did not know what they had found, but he knew that paper and lamplight and the kind of focus he was seeing meant something more than a domestic quarrel. He walked back to the hotel where he was staying and wrote a short message and gave it to Rawlings to deliver to Crane at the mine. "It is worse than the woman," the message said. "The rider knows." Elena had believed she was the only one Victor had broken. The letter in the carpet bag proved she was simply the latest. The hour before dawn was the coldest part of the desert night, when the heat released its grip and the air went still and sharp, and the stars burned close enough to touch. Elena woke into that cold at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering from a dream she did not want to remember. In the dream, she had been back in Victor's kitchen. Everything was quiet. The stove was warm, the bread was rising. Victor was in the other room, and she could hear the creak of his chair and the rustle of a newspaper, and there was no anger in the air, no tension, no waiting for the blow, just the familiar rhythm of a life she knew how to navigate. In the dream, the quiet was a relief so profound it made her want to weep. She lay in the dark and understood what the dream meant. It was not a dream of love. It was a dream of captivity. The mind's desperate reach for the known over the unknown. The body's trained preference for a cage whose dimensions it had memorized over an open space it could not see the edges of. She got up, took her crutch. The boarding house was silent around her, Patterson asleep, the other boarders quiet. Elena moved through the hallway to the front door, her crutch tapping softly on the wooden floor, and she put her hand on the latch. She stood there for a long time. She was 3 seconds from opening that door and walking back to Victor's house, not because she loved him, not because she was weak, because the known horror felt safer than the unknown, because 3 years of abuse had rewired something deep in her brain, the part that assessed danger and chose survival, and that part was screaming at her that the safest place was the place where she already knew the rules. Victor's house had rules, terrible rules, but rules she understood. The future she was trying to build had none, and the absence of rules felt like falling. She stood with her hand on the latch, and she could feel the pull of it, the gravity of the familiar, the seductive whisper that said, "Just go back and be quiet and small and safe, in the way that prisoners are safe inside their cells." Then she looked down at her leg, the splint, the wrappings, the break that Victor had put there because she had opened a drawer and seen something she should not have seen. He did this, she thought, and he will do worse. She took her hand off the latch, went back to her room, sat on the bed and pressed her palms against her eyes and shook. She did not go back to sleep. She did not tell anyone about the moment at the door. But the reader sees it, and everything that Elena does after this night carries the weight of a woman who faced her own weakness and chose to walk the other way. Morning brought new trouble. Harrison was summoned to Silas Crane's office at the mine. The summons came through the mining company foreman, delivered with the casual tone of a routine meeting, but Harrison knew better. He checked his pistol, holstered it, and rode out to the Florida Plata. Crane's office was paneled in dark wood, an absurd luxury in a desert mining town, the panels shipped from San Francisco at considerable expense. The desk was mahogany. The chairs were leather. A crystal decanter of brandy sat on a silver tray beside two glasses, one already poured. Crane stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the mine workings below, the tailings and the head frames and the ant-like figures of men moving in the dust. He turned when Harrison entered. Silas Crane was 50 years old, and looked it, weathered and silver-haired, with the lean, watchful face of a man who had built his fortune by seeing opportunities before other men did, and eliminating obstacles before they became problems. He smiled. It was the smile of a host, warm and practiced and utterly without warmth. "Mr. Grant," he said, "brandy." It was not a question, but Harrison declined it with a shake of his head. Crane shrugged pleasantly and sat behind the desk and gestured for Harrison to take the leather chair opposite. "You handled that business on the road very well," Crane said. "Those men were not mine, of course. Claimed jumpers, I expect. But your response was impressive. I like a man who does not panic." Harrison said nothing. He sat in the chair and kept his face neutral and waited. Crane leaned forward. "You're a smart man, Mr. Grant, I can see that. You have skills that are wasted on simple escort work. I pay smart men well, very well. Walk away from the Zimmerman business. Keep riding my silver shipments, and I will triple your wages. In a year, maybe less, you will have enough for that land you have been saving for." Harrison looked at Crane and saw a man who was accustomed to buying what he wanted, who had bought a sheriff and a storekeep in half a town and saw no reason why a drifting cowboy should be any different. "I appreciate the offer," Harrison said, "but I will have to decline." Crane's smile did not change. "That is a pity," he said. The warmth was gone. The smile remained. "I do hope you will reconsider." Harrison left the mine with the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He had refused Crane's money. In Castle Dome, that was the same as picking a side. He was committed now whether he wanted to be or not. Back at the boarding house, Elena was going through the carpet bag Harrison had brought from Victor's house. She had examined the contents before, but had been too tired and hurt to look closely. Now, with the morning light angling through her window, she went through each item carefully, checking pockets and linings and folds the way a woman does, who has learned that hidden things can be found in hidden places. In the lining of the carpet bag itself, wedged between the outer fabric and the inner frame where the stitching had come loose, she found a letter. It was old. The paper was yellowed and the ink faded. It was addressed to a Mrs. Sarah Collins in Dayton, Ohio, in a woman's handwriting that was not Elena's. The return address was Castle Dome, Arizona Territory, and the name on the return was Lillian Zimmerman. Elena opened the letter with shaking hands and read it. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I am writing to tell you that I am leaving my husband. I have saved what money I can, and I mean to take the stage to Prescott and from there make my way to you. I am frightened, but I am determined. Victor is not the man I believed him to be, and I cannot stay. I do not want you to worry, but I do want you to know that if you do not hear from me by Christmas, something has gone wrong. Please do not forget me." The letter was dated October of 1880, 2 weeks before Lillian had supposedly left Castle Dome of her own accord. Elena sat very still. The letter had never been sent. Lillian had written it and hidden it, probably intending to mail it from Prescott after she escaped, and somehow it had ended up in the lining of the carpet bag, either hidden there by Lillian herself or simply lost. It had been there for 3 years, waiting. Elena's mind worked through the implications like a key turning in a lock. Lillian had been planning to leave. She had saved money. She had written to her sister. And then she had vanished, and Victor had told the town she had gone back east and nobody had asked questions because nobody wanted the answers. Had Lillian made it out? or had something stopped her? The letter offered no answer. It offered only a date, a deadline. If you do not hear from me by Christmas. Had Sarah Collins heard from her sister? Was Lillian alive somewhere in California or Ohio or anywhere at all? Elena showed the letter to Harrison that evening. His face went still as he read it, a particular kind of stillness that she was learning to recognize as his expression when anger and discipline were fighting for control. "We need to find out what happened to her," Harrison said. "If she made it out, that is one thing. If she did not, then you are not just running from a man who hits. You are running from a man who has made a woman disappear before and gotten away with it." The question hung between them, unanswerable for now, adding a new layer of dread to a situation that already had too many. That night, standing by the courtyard well, Harrison told Elena that he had refused Crane's offer. The implication was clear. Crane would not ask twice. Elena looked at Harrison in the lamplight and asked the question that had been forming in her mind all day. "Why do you not just leave? You could ride out of Castledome tonight. No one would stop you. This is not your fight." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. The desert wind moved through the courtyard and stirred the dust at their feet. "Because the last time I told myself something was not my fight, my sister died," he said. And because he paused, and she saw him choose his words with the care of a man handling something fragile, "because you matter to me. Not as a cause or a mission. You. The way you count your coins and memorize numbers and stand on a broken leg when nobody is watching. You matter to me, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." Elena felt something shift in her chest. She looked at Harrison, and he leaned toward her just slightly, a question in his eyes, and she stepped back. Not from fear of him, from fear of herself. From the knowledge that she had been wrong before, had trusted before, had believed in letters written by a man who turned out to be a monster. She did not trust her own judgment. Not yet. "I cannot," she said. "Not yet. I do not know if what I feel is real or just gratitude wearing a mask. I do not want to mistake one for the other." Harrison straightened. There was no hurt in his face, only a quiet respect that made her ache. "When you know, you will know," he said. "I am not going anywhere." He left her by the well and went to his room, and Elena stood alone in the dark courtyard and pressed her hand against her chest where her heart was beating too fast and too hard. Then the night split open for the second time. The smell hit first. Smoke, hot and thick, carried on the night wind from the direction of the stable behind the boarding house. Then the orange glow, then the sound of horses screaming. Harrison was out of his room and through the back door before Elena could get her crutch. She heard him shouting, heard Patterson emerge from her room in a nightgown with a rifle in her hands, heard the roar of flames eating dry wood and hay. By the time Elena made it to the back porch on her crutch, the stable was fully engulfed. Harrison and Patterson and two of the other boarders fought the fire with buckets from the well, a hopeless enterprise against a blaze that had been deliberately set. The fire burned fast and hot, and when it was over, the stable was a heap of glowing timbers and ash. Harrison's horse was dead. Someone had cut the animal's hamstrings before setting the fire. Harrison stood over the carcass with a face like stone and fists that shook at his sides. On the charred frame of the stable door, written in axle grease in letters that had survived the flames long enough to be read, were 6 words. "Next time it is her." 4 people sat around the boarding house kitchen table at midnight. A battered wife, a guilt-haunted cowboy, a doctor with a forbidden book, and a widow with a grudge. They were everything Castledome had to throw against Silas Crane. The taste of ash hung in the air. It had been 2 days since the stable fire, and the smell had not faded, seeping into clothes and hair and food, a constant reminder that the walls were closing in. Elena had called this meeting, and she had done it deliberately, sending word to Whitfield through Patterson, waiting until the streets were empty and the town was asleep, choosing the hour of deepest dark when Dutton and his men were least likely to be watching. She sat at the head of the table. Her broken leg was propped on a stool. Her face was thin and drawn, and the bruises from her fall were fading to yellow-green, ghosts of the violence that had started all of this. But her eyes were clear, and her voice was steady, and when she spoke, the other three listened. "This is what we know," Elena said. She laid the pieces out on the kitchen table, one by one. The torn page from Victor's ledger. The brown paper where she had written the numbers she remembered. Whitfield's medical journal. Harrison's account of the false-bottomed wagon. "Silas Crane is mining silver on public land," she said. "The illegal ore is hidden in false bottoms of the company wagons and shipped with legitimate loads to Castle Dome. Victor launders the money through his store, making the stolen silver appear as ordinary business revenue. Anyone who gets in the way is intimidated, bought off, or made to disappear." She paused. Whitfield's book shows that the violence is not just directed at people who threaten the scheme. It is used to keep the whole town quiet. Frightened wives and broken families do not ask questions. She looked around the table. Patterson, grim and steady, her husband's death giving her a stake in this that went deeper than Elena's. Whitfield, nervous but resolute, his conscience finally outweighing his caution. Harrison, watchful, his bruised hand resting on the table near hers but not touching it. "If we can get this evidence to the United States Marshal's office in Tucson," Elena said, "Crane goes to the territorial prison at Yuma, and this town has a chance to breathe again. The problem is getting it there." "The mail goes through Victor's store," Patterson said. "Crane reads everything that leaves this town." "And Crane controls the roads," Harrison added. "Dutton has men watching the passes. I saw them today. 2 riders up on the ridge above the Gila Bend Road." Elena nodded. She had expected this. She had spent 2 days thinking about it, lying in her bed with her leg aching and her mind working, turning the problem over like a puzzle box. "Harrison," she said, "your next silver shipment is scheduled for Friday. You ride out with the wagon as usual, but instead of coming back after the delivery, you keep riding. Take the evidence straight to Tucson." Harrison's jaw tightened. "That means leaving you here for a week, maybe more, with Dutton and his men in town." "I know what it means," Elena said. "I am not leaving you unprotected." "Then we have nothing," Elena said, and her voice was sharp enough to cut, "because I cannot ride with a broken leg, and you are the only one who can get past the checkpoints with a legitimate reason to be on the road. If you stay here to protect me, the evidence stays here too, and Crane wins by default." Harrison looked at her and she looked at him, and the table was quiet while 2 stubborn people locked horns across it. "You cannot call me strong and then refuse to let me stand alone," Elena said. "Pick one." The words landed. Harrison said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he accepts something he does not like but recognizes as true. Patterson spoke up. "I have a shotgun and no intention of letting Dutton through my front door. Dr. Whitfield has a pistol, do you not, Doctor?" Whitfield blinked. "I have a Derringer. I have never fired it at anything living." "Then let us hope you do not have to," Patterson said, "but keep it loaded." They spent the next 2 hours compiling the evidence into a single package. Elena wrote a clear, organized summary of the financial scheme, cross-referencing the ledger numbers with Harrison's observations about the wagon weights. Whitfield added his medical records with a cover letter attesting to their accuracy. Harrison drew a diagram of the false wagon bottom from memory. Patterson contributed dates and details of her husband's death that she believed connected to Crane's land seizures. When it was done, they had a thick envelope that told a story any marshal worth his badge would want to investigate. Elena sealed it with candle wax and wrote the address of the United States Marshal's office in Tucson on the front. "Guard this with your life," she told Harrison. He took the envelope and held her gaze and said, "I will be back." "I know," she said, "but if you are not—" She stopped, started again. "If you are not, I want you to know something. You gave me back the belief that I deserve better than what I got. I had lost that. You found it for me." Harrison's face did something complicated, the hard lines softening and then going hard again, as if he was fighting to keep something contained. "You deserve more than I know how to give," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges. Then he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, not her lips. She was still legally Victor's wife, and they both honored that line without discussing it, as if the discussion would cheapen the restraint. He kissed her forehead, and the warmth of it spread through her like sunlight, and when he pulled back, she could still feel the press of his lips on her skin. She would feel it for days. After the meeting broke up and the others left, Elena sat alone in the courtyard. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over Castle Dome were savage in their brightness. She touched her forehead where Harrison's lips had been. Then she picked up a kitchen knife from the table beside her, and she cut her hair. She cut it short, the way men wore it, above the collar and off the neck, not for beauty, not for grief, for practicality. If she had to run, long hair was a liability. It could be grabbed, caught, used to control her. She had worn it long for Victor because Victor liked it long, and every inch she cut away was an inch of the woman he had tried to make her. The dark hair fell onto the courtyard stones and lay there like something shed. Elena ran her hand over the short crop that remained and felt lighter. Harrison rode out of Castle Dome before dawn. He carried the envelope inside his saddlebag, pressed flat between his bedroll and a change of clothes. He rode a borrowed horse, since his own had been killed in the stable fire, a rangy bay gelding that Patterson's neighbor had agreed to lend him. He did not look back at the boarding house as he left. If he looked back, he would not leave, and they both knew it. He did not know that Dutton had been standing in the shadows of the livery stable across the street, watching. Dutton had seen Harrison check the saddlebag twice, had seen the way the cowboy touched the bag, the protective gesture of a man carrying something more valuable than provisions. Dutton sent Rawlings and the young gun hand out the back road 30 minutes later, riding fast to reach the narrows of Gila Bend ahead of Harrison. 2 gunshots echoed through Gila Bend Canyon. At the same moment, 40 miles away in Castle Dome, Elena heard a knock on her door and knew instantly it was not Harrison. The narrows of Gila Bend were a bad place for an ambush, and a good place for dying. The canyon walls rose sheer on both sides, red and orange sandstone banded with darker layers, and the road squeezed between them barely wide enough for a wagon. The floor was sand and loose rock, and the echoes played tricks, making a single shot sound like 3, and a shout sound like a chorus. Harrison came through the narrows at a trot, watchful but not alarmed. He had been on the road for 4 hours and had seen nothing suspicious, which in itself was suspicious. Crane's men had been watching the passes for days. The fact that nobody had tried to stop him suggested either that he had gotten lucky or that they were waiting somewhere specific. They were waiting at the narrows. Rawlings fired first, from behind a boulder on the right side of the canyon. The bullet hit the sandstone wall 2 feet from Harrison's head and sprayed rock chips into his face. Harrison threw himself off the horse and hit the ground rolling, pulling his rifle from the boot as he went. The horse bolted forward through the narrows and was gone. The second shot came from the left side, the young gun hand firing too early and too high, the bullet whining off stone somewhere above Harrison's head. Harrison pressed himself flat behind a rock ledge and assessed. 2 shooters, one on each side, elevated but not well positioned. Rawlings was the dangerous one, the experienced killer. The young one was nervous and shooting wild. Harrison waited. Patience was the deputy's tool. Rushing got you killed. He lay behind the rock and listened to the echoes die and watched the shadows move. Rawlings shifted. Just a small movement, adjusting his position behind the boulder, but it was enough. Harrison saw the dark shape of the man's shoulder and fired. The bullet hit rock and Rawlings jerked back. Harrison fired again, lower, and heard a grunt of pain. Not a killing shot, but enough to make Rawlings think twice. The young gun hand panicked. He broke from cover and ran for his horse, firing backward without aiming. Harrison rose to one knee and put a round into the dirt between the man's feet. The gun hand's horse spooked and bolted. The man scrambled after it, firing once more over his shoulder, and the bullet was the one that found its mark. It clipped Harrison's left shoulder, a hot, tearing graze that spun him sideways and put him on the ground. He lay in the dust and breathed, and the sky above the canyon was very blue, and very far away. Blood ran warm down his arm. He could move the shoulder, which meant the bullet had not hit bone. He could grip the rifle, which meant the muscles were cut but not destroyed. He was still in the fight. Rawlings was not. The older man had taken Harrison's second shot in the thigh and was trying to drag himself back to his horse, leaving a blood trail in the sand. Harrison watched him go. He did not fire again. He had killed one man in his life, and it had not saved anyone, and he was not going to kill another unless there was no other choice. The gun hand and Rawlings retreated, wounded and horseless in one case, mounted but bleeding in the other. Harrison was left alone in the canyon with a grazed shoulder and no horse, and a long way to go. He found the saddlebag where it had fallen when his horse bolted. The envelope was still inside, dusty and blood-stained, but intact. He shouldered the bag and started walking. 20 miles to the relay station at Mesquite Wells. 20 miles of desert in summer. He had one canteen, half full, a wounded shoulder that needed cleaning and binding. The sun was already high and would only get higher. He walked. The desert tried to kill him in the patient, methodical way the desert killed everything. Heat first, pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck, drawing sweat that evaporated before it could cool him. Then thirst, the canteen emptied by the 5th mile, his tongue going thick and his lips cracking. Then the subtle, creeping confusion that came with dehydration, the blurring of the horizon, the way the rocks began to shimmer and move. He talked to Hannah. He did it without meaning to. The heat and the blood loss and the desolation stripping away the barriers he kept between himself and his grief. "I am sorry," he said to the empty desert. "I am sorry I waited. I am sorry I told myself it was not my business. I am sorry I was afraid." The desert did not answer, but he kept talking. He told Hannah about Elena, about the flour jar and the stolen pennies and the way she stood on one leg in the moonlight and refused to fall. He told Hannah that he thought he was in love, and that he was terrified of it because the last person he loved, he had failed. "Am I doing it right this time?" he asked the horizon. "Hannah, am I doing it right?" The horizon shimmered. A shape appeared in the distance that might have been a building or might have been a mirage. Harrison kept walking toward it because there was nothing else to do. It was the relay station. It was real. He staggered through the door and collapsed on the floor, and a startled station keeper gave him water and cleaned his wound and asked what the hell had happened. Harrison drank until his hands stopped shaking. Then he asked for 2 things: a fresh horse and access to the telegraph wire. He sent the evidence by wire. He dictated the contents of Elena's financial summary and Whitfield's medical findings and his own testimony about the false-bottomed wagons to the telegraph operator, who tapped it out in code to the United States Marshal's office in Tucson, one long transmission that took 40 minutes and cost Harrison every cent he had. Then he got on the borrowed horse and turned back toward Castle Dome, because Elena was there. And the stable fire and the threat on the door told him that Crane was not going to wait for the law to arrive. 40 miles east, in Castle Dome, Elena's war was already underway. Dutton came to the boarding house at mid-morning with Sheriff Morrison in tow. Morrison wore his badge and his gun, and the expression of a man being marched to his own hanging. Dutton stood behind him with the quiet confidence of a man who held the leash. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Morrison said, and his voice cracked on the name. "I have been instructed. That is." He cleared his throat. "I have an order to return you to your husband's custody. You are still legally his wife, and territorial law requires." He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. Elena looked at him from her chair in the courtyard where she had been shelling peas for Patterson's supper, and she saw the sweat on his upper lip and the way his eyes refused to meet hers, and the hand on his pistol that was not there for protection but for reassurance, the way a child holds a blanket. "Sheriff," Elena said, "I would like to speak with you privately, without Mr. Dutton present." Morrison looked at Dutton. Dutton looked at Morrison. A calculation passed between them, too fast for words, and Dutton checked his pocket watch and nodded once and leaned against the courtyard wall with his arms folded. Elena and Morrison went inside. She had approximately 5 minutes before Dutton's patience ran out. She could see him through the window checking the watch again, and she spoke fast and clear. "You know what Crane is doing?" she said. "You know about the illegal mining and the laundering and the false manifests? You know what happens to the women in this town? You have seen the bruises as many times as Dr. Whitfield has. If you hand me back to Victor, I will die in that house, and you will carry my death on your conscience for every day you have left on this earth." Morrison's face was gray. His hand shook. "But here is what matters to you," Elena continued, because she had spent 2 days studying this man, and she knew he was not brave enough to be moved by justice, but might be smart enough to be moved by self-interest. Harrison Grant is on his way to the United States Marshal in Tucson right now with enough evidence to bring Crane down. When the Marshal rides into Castle Dome, and he will ride in, you can be the sheriff who cooperated, or you can be the one standing in chains next to Crane in the territorial courtroom in Prescott. You have about 3 minutes to decide which man you want to be." Morrison stared at her. She watched the emotions cross his face like weather across a plain. Fear. Calculation. The slow, painful emergence of something that was not courage, exactly, but its pragmatic cousin, the recognition that the smart bet had shifted. He walked outside. Dutton straightened from the wall. "She is not here," Morrison said. "Left in the night. I do not know where she went." Dutton looked at him for a long moment. He did not believe it. Elena could see that from inside the window. But Dutton was a precise man, and a precise man did not tear apart a boarding house in broad daylight in front of witnesses when his employer wanted discretion. Dutton left. Morrison left. Elena sat in the courtyard and breathed, and her hands shook until Patterson brought her whiskey-laced tea and she drank it and stopped shaking. But Crane was not finished. That night, Elena woke to Patterson shaking her shoulder. "The roof is burning," Patterson said. Her voice was calm because Patterson's voice was always calm, but her eyes were wide and the orange light of flames was already dancing on the ceiling. Elena smelled smoke and heard the crackle of fire overhead, and she grabbed her crutch and got to her feet. And through the window she saw Dutton standing across the street in the light of the fire, arms folded, watching the front door. He expected her to run out the front, straight to him. 3 years with Victor had taught Elena one skill that might save her life. Never run in the direction your enemy expects. She did not run out the front door. She grabbed Patterson by the arm and said, "Back room. Storage. Now." Patterson did not ask questions. She ran. Elena hobbled after her, every step a fight with her healing leg, pain shooting through the bone with each impact, but her mind clear and sharp and already 3 moves ahead. The storage room in the back of the boarding house was small and cluttered, stacked with crates and barrels, and the accumulated possessions of a woman who never threw anything away. But Elena had noticed something about this room 3 days earlier, during one of her slow, crutch-assisted explorations of the building. The back wall was old adobe, cracked and weakened by years of weather and neglect. A section near the corner had a visible gap where the mud plaster had crumbled to reveal the straw and stick frame beneath. Elena picked up a wooden crate and swung it at the weakened section of wall. The first blow cracked the adobe. The second broke through. The third opened a hole large enough for a person to crawl through. Patterson stared at her, and then understood, and grabbed a barrel stave and started widening the opening from her side. They got the other boarders through, 2 miners and a traveling salesman who had been asleep upstairs and were coughing from the smoke that was filling the building. Elena went last, squeezing through the gap in the wall on her hands and her good knee, dragging her splinted leg behind her, biting through her lip again because the pain was extraordinary, and she would not scream. They emerged into the alley behind the boarding house. The night air was thick with smoke, and the roar of the fire was a living thing above them, consuming the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky. Elena led them along the alley and through the back door of Dr. Whitfield's building next door, pounding on his door until he opened it, and they tumbled inside gasping and coughing and alive. Elena had saved herself. She had saved others. Nobody rescued her. In the chaos of the fire, with townspeople pouring into the streets and bucket brigades forming, and the whole of Castle Dome lit in hellish orange, Victor Zimmerman appeared. He found Elena at Whitfield's building. She was sitting on the front steps, her leg throbbing, her face smudged with soot, her cropped hair wild. Patterson was beside her with the shotgun across her knees. Victor approached slowly, his hands visible, his face drawn and haggard in the firelight. He was sober. He looked 10 years older than the last time she had seen him. "Elena," he said, "listen to me. Crane wants you dead. Dutton has orders. You need to leave Castle Dome tonight, right now." Elena looked at the man who had thrown her down 17 stairs, the man who had beaten her for 3 years, the man who had been too afraid to protect her and too weak to leave and too trapped to see any way out except through violence. "Why are you helping me?" she said. Victor stood there in the firelight, and she could see him struggling with something that he did not have the words or maybe the courage to say. "Because I have destroyed enough," he said finally. "And because part of me remembers being the man who wrote those letters to you 3 years ago. The man who wanted to be good. That man is dead, but let him do one decent thing before they bury him." Elena studied his face. She did not trust him. She would never trust him again. But she recognized something she had seen once before, in his eyes at the boarding house when he came to beg her to return. Fear, yes, but also exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man who has been carrying a weight too heavy for him and has finally accepted that he cannot carry it any longer. His help was not selfless. She understood that. If she escaped and the evidence reached the marshal, Crane went to prison and Victor had a chance to run. He was saving himself by saving her. The two acts overlapped, and the morality was deliberately muddy. But the horse he led toward her was real, and the cash he pressed into her hand was real, and the south road he pointed her toward was real. "Take the road toward Mesquite Wells," he said. "If your cowboy made it through the canyon, that is where he will be." "What are you going to do?" Elena asked. Victor looked at her, and for one moment his face was the face of the man who had written those letters, the man who had wanted a wife and a home, and a life that did not involve terror and greed and violence. Then the moment passed, and he was just Victor again, diminished and defeated. "Run," he said. "Same as you." He turned and walked toward the north road. Not toward Dutton, not toward Crane. Away. The only direction left to a man who had burned every other bridge. Elena did not watch him go. She mounted the horse, a task that took Patterson's help and an act of will that left her gasping, and she pointed the animal south and rode into the dark. Behind her, the boarding house burned, and the fire painted Castle Dome in shades of hell, and the townspeople worked their buckets, and Victor Zimmerman walked north into the desert night, alone. Dutton found him 2 miles from town. Victor heard the hoofbeats behind him and knew who it was before he turned. He did not run. There was nowhere left to run. Dutton did not ask where Elena had gone. It did not matter anymore. Crane had decided that Victor was a liability regardless, a loose end in a scheme that was unraveling, and loose ends were what Dutton was paid to tie off. One shot, quick and clean. Dutton was a precise man. Victor Zimmerman died on the North Road out of Castle Dome at 2:30 in the morning. He died the way he had lived, running from something he should have faced, paying the final price for choices made in fear. He was not a hero. He was not redeemed. He was simply finished. Elena heard the shot from a mile south. A single crack in the night, distant and final. She did not know who had fired or who had fallen. She pulled the horse's head around and looked back at the glow of the burning town and the dark desert beyond it, and she felt a cold hand close around her heart. Then she turned south again and rode on, because that was what she had learned to do. Keep going. Do not look back. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, and it was still better than the road behind. She rode through the night. The desert opened around her, vast and silver in the moonlight, and the horse Victor had given her was steady and sure-footed on the sandy road. Her leg throbbed with every stride, but she locked her jaw and endured it the way she had endured everything else, by putting one moment in front of the next and refusing to stop. Dawn was a thin line of gold on the eastern horizon when she saw the rider. He was coming toward her from the south, silhouetted against the lightening sky, and for a terrible moment she did not know if it was Harrison or one of Crane's men. She pulled the horse up and sat very still, her hand on the reins, her heart in her throat. Then the rider got close enough for her to see the way he sat a horse, the particular tilt of his shoulders, the hat pulled low against the coming sun. And she knew. Harrison. He was riding a horse she did not recognize, a long-legged roan that moved with the easy gait of a relay station mount. His left arm was bound against his chest with a strip of cloth that showed blood at the shoulder. His face was burned by sun and haggard with exhaustion, and when he saw her, his expression went through so many changes so fast that she could not track them all. They stopped their horses 10 feet apart in the middle of the empty desert. "You got out," Harrison said. "I got myself out," Elena said. Harrison nodded. There was no surprise in his face, only recognition. He had always known she could. They sat there in the silence for a long moment. The sun was coming up, and the desert was turning gold around them, and they were both wounded and exhausted and covered in dust and ash and blood. It was not romantic. It was not the way love stories were supposed to go. It was better than that. It was real. Elena reached for him. She leaned across the gap between the horses and kissed him, and it was not gentle or tentative. It was fierce and desperate, and it tasted like smoke and blood and the salt of her own tears, and it was the most honest thing she had ever done. Harrison's good arm came around her, and he held her as close as two people on separate horses could hold each other, and he kissed her back with the same fierceness, the same desperation, the same absolute refusal to let go. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads touching, breathing hard, he said, "I was afraid I was too late again." She said, "You were not, and I was not waiting." A long silence. The sun rose higher. The desert turned from gold to white. Two horses stood side by side on the empty road, and two people sat on them with their hands linked across the gap, and neither spoke, and neither needed to. Then Elena said, "Did you send it? The evidence?" "Sent it by telegraph wire from Mesquite Wells. Every word, the marshal's office has it all. Then it is done." "Not quite," Harrison said. He looked south, then north, toward the faint smudge of smoke still visible on the horizon. Castle Dome. But almost. They turned the horses toward Mesquite Wells and rode together into the morning. Behind them, in the distance, a sound reached them on the wind. Hoofbeats. Not one horse or two. Many. Coming from the east, from the direction of Tucson, and moving fast. The marshal had received the wire. United States Marshal Samuel Reeves rode into Castle Dome at mid-morning with 6 deputies and a warrant. He found a half-burned town, a dead man by the North Road, and a silver empire collapsing like a mine shaft with the timbers pulled. Crane was arrested at the Flora de Plata mine without a fight. He was sitting at his mahogany desk in his wood-paneled office drinking brandy when the deputies came through the door. He set down his glass and put his hands on the desk and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The numbers Elena had memorized, the testimony Harrison had dictated to the telegraph operator, the medical records Whitfield had kept for 10 years, they told a story that no amount of money or influence could rewrite. Dutton was found at the hotel packing his bags. He considered drawing on the deputies and then looked at 6 aimed rifles and reconsidered. He put his hands up and let them take his weapons and said only one thing as they led him out. "The woman," he said. "She is smarter than all of us." They would both stand trial in the territorial court at Prescott. The charges were extensive. Illegal mining on public land, fraud, intimidation, destruction of property. And for Dutton, murder. Victor Zimmerman's body was found on the North Road at daybreak, a single bullet wound to the chest, and Dutton's pistol matched the caliber. The territorial prison at Yuma waited for both of them. Men spoke of Yuma the way they spoke of certain kinds of death, quietly and with a particular tightness around the eyes. Sheriff Morrison cooperated fully. He testified against Crane with the thoroughness of a man saving his own skin, and the marshal allowed it because Morrison's testimony filled gaps that the other evidence left open. Morrison kept his badge, he kept his office, he kept his life, but he lost every shred of respect he had ever held in Castle Dome, and he would live out his remaining years as the man who had looked the other way while women were beaten and minors disappeared and a silver empire was built on blood. It was not justice in the fullest sense, but it was the closest thing to punishment that cowardice allowed. Dr. Whitfield submitted his private medical ledger as supplementary evidence. The marshal looked at 10 years of documented abuse, 43 broken bones, and 27 of them belonging to women. And his face went hard in a way that promised thorough prosecution. Other women came forward in the days that followed. Wives of miners and teamsters who had been silent for years found that the silence had been broken for them, and they could finally speak. They spoke. Elena and Harrison came back to Castle Dome 4 days after the fire. They arrived on horseback, riding side by side, and the town watched them come in, the way a town watches anything remarkable, from behind curtains and around corners, with whispers and pointing and the particular intensity of people witnessing something they will tell their grandchildren about. Elena went to Whitfield first to have her leg examined. The ride had not been kind to the healing bone, and she was in considerable pain, but Whitfield pronounced the break still sound, the splint still holding. "Rest," he said. The same thing he always said. Rest and time. Then she asked the question she had been carrying since she heard the gunshot in the desert night. "Victor," she said. Whitfield told her. "Dead on the North Road. Shot by Dutton. He had been heading away from town, alone, on foot, running." Elena sat in Whitfield's office and felt the news settle into her. She had expected it. Some part of her had known since she heard the shot. But expecting and knowing were different things, and the reality of it opened a space inside her that was more complicated than grief. She did not mourn Victor the way a widow was supposed to mourn. She felt relief that he could never hurt her again, clear and shameless relief that she did not try to dress up as something more acceptable. She felt sorrow, not for the man he had been in their marriage, but for the man he might have been if different choices and different pressures had shaped him. She felt a strange, complicated gratitude for the horse and the warning and the cash, even knowing that his motives had been selfish as much as generous. She did not feel guilt. She had carried enough of that. It was Victor's turn. Harrison found her sitting on the steps of Whitfield's building, looking out at the half-burned town, and he sat beside her and took her hand. "You are allowed to feel whatever you feel," he said. "Nobody gets to judge that." She leaned against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and for a few minutes she let herself simply be tired. The marshal's investigation uncovered one more thing that mattered. Among Crane's seized papers was a document showing that Lillian, Victor's first wife, had not been killed or buried in the desert, or any of the other dark possibilities that had haunted Elena since Patterson first spoke her name. Crane had paid Victor $200 to put Lillian on a stage to San Francisco, with enough money to start over and a clear instruction never to return or write or tell anyone where she had been. Lillian was alive. She had remarried under a different name. She was living in Sacramento. The worst possibility had not been the truth. Elena read the document and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight for weeks. Lillian had gotten out. The cycle was not unbreakable. Women escaped. Women survived. Women rebuilt. The weeks that followed were filled with legal proceedings and practical decisions, and the slow, painful work of building a future from the ashes of the past. As Victor's widow, Elena inherited what remained of the dry goods store. The illegal assets were seized by the territorial authorities, but the building itself and the legitimate stock were hers. She sold both. The building went to a mining company clerk who wanted to start a hardware business. The stock went to a trader passing through on his way to Yuma. Combined with her flour jar savings, the total came to just over $300. It was not a fortune, but it was hers. She used it to buy land. 10 acres near Silver City, New Mexico territory, a full day's ride east of Castle Dome, in a valley where a creek ran clear over smooth stones and the grass grew green even in summer. Good soil, room for a garden and a house, and a small oven for baking. She bought it herself. She signed the deed herself. She held the paper in her own 2 hands and read her name on it and felt something that she had not felt in so long that she almost did not recognize it. Pride. Harrison, separately, bought 20 acres adjacent to hers. His savings from the mining company were substantial, carefully set aside over months of living frugally and working hard. And the land he chose was good horse country, rolling and open with water access and natural shelter. 2 properties, side by side, separated by the creek. They were building a life next to each other, not on top of each other, not one absorbed into the other. 2 independent foundations, close enough to share strength, but separate enough that neither depended on the other for survival. Harrison came to Elena's land on a morning in late October when the aspens along the creek had turned gold, and the air was crisp and clean with the first hint of coming winter. She was pacing off the footprint of the house she planned to build, marking corners with stones. Her broken leg now healed enough to walk without the crutch, though she still limped, and probably always would. She wore trousers and a man's shirt, and her cropped hair, and her face was brown from sun and wind. And she looked nothing like the woman he had found at the bottom of the stairs in Castle Dome. She looked like someone new, someone she was building from the ground up, the same way she was building the house. Harrison stood at the edge of her property with his hat in his hands. He had cleaned up, shaved, put on a shirt that was not dusty or blood-stained. He looked nervous. Elena had never seen him nervous before, and the sight of it made her heart do something fast and complicated. "I want to ask you something," he said. "But first I need you to know, if you say no, I will still be on the other side of that creek. You will not lose me by saying no. I am asking you not because you need me or because I need you, but because life with you in it is better than any dream I ever had on my own." Elena looked at him, at the scar through his eyebrow and the weathered face and the dark eyes that were steady, even when his hands were not, at the man who had walked into a stranger's house and picked her up off the floor and carried her into the light, and then stood beside her while she fought her own battles, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her. "Yes," she said, "but I have a condition." "Name it. Both pieces of land stay in our separate names. I will not put my whole life in one man's hands again, not even yours." Harrison looked at her, and there was nothing in his face but love and respect and something like pride. "I would have been disappointed if you said anything else," he said. He kissed her, and she kissed him back. And it was not the desperate, smoke-flavored kiss on the desert road. It was quieter than that, deeper. The kiss of 2 people who had found each other in the worst of places and chosen each other in the best and clearest way. They married in the spring. It was a small ceremony. Wildflowers bloomed along the creek, purple and yellow and white, improbable and beautiful in the New Mexico sun. Mrs. Patterson traveled from Castle Dome to stand as witness. Dr. Whitfield came too, and Elena asked him to walk her down the aisle because he was the first person who had kept an honest record of what happened to women like her. He cried during the ceremony quietly, and Patterson handed him a handkerchief and told him to pull himself together. Elena wore a blue dress she had made herself. Harrison wore a dark suit and a white shirt and his best boots. They stood in the sunlight beside the creek that separated their lands and joined their lives. And the minister said the words, and they said their vows. And when it was done, Elena felt none of the dread that had marked her first marriage. Only joy, clean and simple and earned. Elena opened a bakery in Silver City. The sign above the door read, "Elena's," in painted letters. Not Grant's, her name, her work. She baked bread and cinnamon rolls and pies, and the people of Silver City lined up for them, and told her she had a gift, and she believed them because she had learned, finally, to believe good things about herself. Harrison raised horses on his 20 acres. He had a talent for it, the same patience and steadiness that made him good with frightened people, making him good with young, nervous animals. His horses were known for their temperament and their training, and men came from neighboring counties to buy them. In the evenings, after the work was done and the bread was cooling on the counter and the horses were fed and watered, they sat on the porch of the house they had built together. The porch Harrison had framed and Elena had finished, sanding the rails and painting them white. The porch had 17 steps leading up from the yard. Elena had built those steps herself. She measured and cut and nailed every one. She counted them as she worked, the way she counted everything, the pennies in her flour jar, the stairs in Victor's house, the days Harrison was gone, the columns of numbers in a ledger that had changed her life. 17 steps. The same number as the staircase in Castle Dome. She had chosen the number on purpose. But these stairs led up. On a spring evening, 1 year after their wedding, Elena stood on the porch and looked down those 17 steps. The light was gold, and the creek flashed silver through the aspens, and the mountains in the distance were turning purple with dusk. She could smell bread from the kitchen and hay from the barn and the clean, sharp scent of New Mexico pine. She thought about the woman she had been. The woman on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, tasting blood and defeat, counting steps because counting was the only thing she could do when the world was beyond her control. She thought about the flour jar and the stolen pennies, and the letter she could not send. She thought about the night she stood at the boarding house door with her hand on the latch, 3 seconds from walking back to captivity. She thought about all of it. She would always think about it. Those memories were part of her the same way the limp was part of her, permanent reminders of a life she had survived. But they did not own her. She had taken them and built something with them, the way you take broken stone and build a wall, the way you take ash and feed a garden. From inside the house, Harrison called out, "Bread is about to burn." Elena laughed. It was an easy sound, unguarded, the kind of laugh she had not known she was capable of making 4 years ago. The kind of laugh that came from a woman who was not afraid, who was not hiding, who was standing on her own ground in every sense of the word. She turned and climbed the first step toward home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.